Hello, everyone. I'm Millie from the Australian Youth Aerospace Association. This morning, we'll be speaking with Pam Melroy, who's an ex-NASA astronaut, Space Shuttle Commander, Nova Systems Director of Space, and all-round awesome woman. To start with, the Australian Youth Aerospace Association is who I'm working with. Our goal is to deliver info about space, awareness and involvement in our aerospace industry to people all across Australia. Every year we host a conference called Aerospace Futures, and this year it was going to be in Adelaide, but unfortunately got cancelled, the physical event, so we've been running our online events. And today's is with Pam. So the format of our event today is that we'll have a short presentation from Pam. She'll tell us a little bit about herself, her study and work background, career highlights, where she is now. And then she'll speak about what the benefit of working in Australia is, why she moved to Australia and what we have to offer. And then Pam's also going to speak about the Moon to Mars program, which was a recent initiative that the Australian Space Agency signed up for in 2019, and Nova Systems' involvement with that. So I will hand over to Pam. Audience questions are more than welcome. You can send them through live on Facebook and we'll answer them at the end of Pam's presentation.
Thank you so much, Millie, and thank you to everybody who logged in quite this early in the morning. It's later in the evening for me, but I know it's very early for you. So welcome to everybody who joined this early. And welcome to those of you who are going to watch later on, which I completely understand. So it's always fantastic to be able to talk to my friends in Australia. So I'm excited about that. It's been since March that I was able to travel to Australia. So I miss everyone. I'm going to start out with some slides, just as Millie talked about. I'm just going to share a little bit about my background, and she already introduced me, so I'll just go from here. So when I was a kid, there were no women astronauts, and I thought there was something wrong with that. So I decided I wanted to be an astronaut. Now, all the astronauts that I knew about from Apollo were military jet test pilots. And so I decided that's what I was going to do too. I was going to go into the Air Force, become a pilot and then a test pilot. And that's exactly what happened. And I was very fortunate that the Air Force opened women, flying to women when I was about 16. And then of course, after that, I just had the opportunity to progress throughout the Air Force. So I started flying the airplane on the left, the white one. It's a refueling aircraft, a KC-10. And then I moved on in my career to becoming a test pilot after getting lots of experience. And I flew the developmental test for the aircraft on the right. Some of you may recognize it because Australia also uses the C-17. So I had the opportunity to fly that airplane and do a lot of things for the first time with it, but more importantly, to develop the procedures and the manuals and the advice to give to people who fly it today. And I really loved that job. It was super fun, but I'd always wanted to be an astronaut. And so after my experience as a C-17 test pilot, I was selected as an astronaut. Now, my career as an astronaut was on the Space Shuttle. And the Space Shuttle spanned a 30-year career from 1981 to 2011. And when we first started the Space Shuttle, it had two main missions. And the first one was to deploy and service satellites, most famously the Hubble Space Telescope. So the Space Shuttle would launch with a telescope in the payload bay, the very large payload bay of a shuttle, and then using a combination typically of robotics and sometimes spacewalking, would release a satellite and sometimes come back and service it like the Hubble. But the other really exciting thing that we could do on the Space Shuttle was science in microgravity. So if you stop and think about how you do experiments here on the Earth, you try to change one variable at a time and see what happens. Well, changing the variable of gravity is a very big variable. And in fact, what we've learned is all kinds of things behave differently in microgravity. Now, I should stop for a moment and say, we often refer to our experience going around and around the Earth as zero gravity. There's actually no such thing as zero gravity. Gravity is everywhere. It's the law. But what happens is you're going around and around the Earth fast enough that the centrifugal force balances out from gravity, and so everything floats. So we call it microgravity. So not only do we see fluids like my friend Koichi Wakata from Japan showing that in space, the most important effect on fluids is surface tension. And so liquids will form a perfect sphere. But we learned lots of other exciting and interesting things as well. And I should mention another key part of doing science in space is not just inside the spacecraft, but actually looking at our beautiful Earth. The ability to see things such as weather phenomena and the upper atmosphere dynamically real time is very exciting. So the problem with the space shuttle, though, is after we had done it for about 20 years, we'd learned a lot about science in space, but the shuttle only flew about 7 to 10 days, sometimes at the most about 2 weeks at a time. Now imagine if you had a major national laboratory and you only ran it 5 or 6 times a year for about 10 days at a time. It's a little tantalizing and a little frustrating. So the idea was to partner with countries around the world to build a facility where we could do science 24/7, 365 days a year. And that program is the International Space Station. So this is an incredible, very bold endeavor to build this huge laboratory about the size of a 5-bedroom house, but more importantly, to set it up so that we could do science. And even more importantly than that, that we could do it internationally with our international partners. My career was defined by this third and final capability of the space shuttle, which was to assemble the International Space Station. So how we did that was we would put an element of the space station, because it's way too big to launch all together, and put it into the payload bay of the shuttle. A few pieces went up a few different ways, but most of the pieces went up this way. And the elements were built by the United States, but also by our international partners. This is a picture of Node 2, known as Harmony. It was designed to be the hub of all the international laboratories. And it was built in Italy by Thales Alenia. So we carried that up to the space station. And then we used a combination of the robotic arm of the space shuttle and the space station, both built by Canada as their contribution to human spaceflight, known as Canadarm1 and Canadarm2. So we could use the Canadarm, either one, or sometimes both, to lift something out of the payload bay and maneuver it into position. And steadily and slowly, one at a time, in some cases 2 at a time, we were able to assemble the space station over the period of several years. And that was what my career was. It was a very complicated set of scenarios. It was highly dependent. You had to figure out what element had to go first. And even once you got it into space, you had to follow a very careful sequence of robotics and spacewalking and then turning switches on and activating things. But you got your reward at the end when you backed away from the space station and you could see that a new piece was there and it looked different than before you came. So the spacewalkers played an incredibly important role because many of the tasks were too fine to do with that big chunky robotic arm. And so the final connections all had to be made by spacewalkers. It's a very complex ballet between the robotic arm and spacewalkers assembling the space station. So I had the opportunity to fly 3 times to the International Space Station. And on my 3rd mission, I was the mission commander. and commanded the space shuttle mission and also landed the shuttle back on Earth. Like I said, the space station was an amazing achievement for us to do this complex set of operations to put it together. But I think it's important to understand that it was also an amazing achievement because it brought so many different countries together to work on something that was about science and exploration together. And in fact, the space station has repeatedly been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for that exact reason. And it was a wonderful thing to be a part of that. So after my career as a Space Shuttle Commander was coming to an end, I decided I needed to know a little bit about industry. So I had been working on the NASA side on Orion, the world's first lunar-capable human vehicle since Apollo. After NASA, I left and went to Lockheed Martin and worked for a few years to help design and build this vehicle for NASA. Then I started hearing about this thing called commercial space. So probably everyone has heard of SpaceX at some point or another. They've done some pretty amazing things, but I can tell you back in 2011, hardly anybody had heard of them. So I went to work on commercial launch at the regulator in the United States. So I got the opportunity to see what all these companies like Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin and SpaceX, all the exciting things that they were working on. And I could see how they were going to change things over the next decade. After a few years of working there at the regulator, working closely with commercial space, I was invited to join the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which is a blue sky research agency in the government here in the United States. Not only did I have the opportunity to work on complex spacecraft like robotic servicers and repairers of spacecraft, working closely with commercial industry. I also got to work on things like robotics, autonomous ships, and all kinds of other technologies, including artificial intelligence. And that was really fun. That was an appointment. I stayed there for 4 years, and it was a tremendous, exciting job. And then the time came to an end, and I was sort of wondering what I might do next when I got a phone call from the founder of Nova Systems, Jim Wally. He's a dear friend, another test pilot that I had met on some of my many, many trips to Australia previously. And he said, "Hey, I think things are really heating up in Australia in space. Would you like to move to Australia and work for Nova Systems?" So as I mentioned, the world space industry, it's not just commercial, a lot of activities popping up all over the world. And it was so important for Australia to have their own space agency, because the way things work in space is there really needs to be government oversight. There's a famous treaty that just about everyone is signed up to, the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, that says a country must have some kind of oversight of their industry. Well, for Australia, there was just a small office, and frankly, Australia was missing out on the growth of this industry. So we were very excited to live in Australia for a year. We tried to visit as many places as possible, including Uluru and the Apostles, and we went to just about every city. I haven't made it to Darwin yet. I need to get up there on a future trip, but we absolutely loved living in Australia. But what was really exciting about the year, of course, was the birth of the Australian Space Agency, July 1st. So just an amazing thing to be there at the very beginning of a space agency. There's a lot going on in space, and many established space agencies like NASA are actually struggling to try to keep up with what's happening in commercial and in policy and in global partnerships. They're really trying to reinvent everything. Australia really had an advantage in that they could start with a clean sheet of paper and say, yeah, this is about industry. And I think that's really, really important. It's about jobs and it's about opportunities. and to get in on a high growth industry. And that's really what the space agency is focused on. But frankly, they're also very focused on you. They know that in order to have a good industry, we need to have students who are studying in all kinds of disciplines, STEM, yes, but in other areas too, to prepare to grow the industry. Just want to take a moment to talk about why international partnerships are important. You probably got a pretty good sense from the International Space Station how so many countries came together to make a difference. But I think it's really important to kind of understand what it brings if you are a country that perhaps may not have an established space agency and may not have a very big budget to start with. So the picture on the left is a picture of a CubeSat launcher on the space station. As a part of membership in the space station, each country had a certain amount of payload that it could take to space. And that included the ability to ride share small satellites and eject them from the space station. Something that normally at the time at the beginning of the space station could cost up to $10 million just to launch a CubeSat. And in fact, in a lot of cases, there wasn't even anybody willing to give you a ride. Well, frankly, the International Space Station changed everything. Countries could spend less than $1 million to launch a CubeSat. The picture on the right is the Mars 2020 rover. And obviously it's kind of hard to read, but what you can get a sense of is that there are a ton of experiments. Well, it might be hard for any one of the countries that participated in the development of the Mars 2020 rover to actually send a rover safely to Mars. Instead, they could participate by bringing a payload and contributing that to the science. By contributing a payload, they get the chance to get a ride and to share in everyone else's science as well. So you can really, really leverage the amount of money you're spending and the opportunities that you have by partnering with others. Fortunately, the Australian Space Agency recognized this right away. And to me, in what was an incredibly fast effort, only 14 months after they started, Australia signed an agreement, a statement of intent, to join the Moon to Mars initiative with NASA. This was just one of the most exciting moments. I was there in the audience, and along with Australian-born astronaut Andy Thomas, and we were just clutching each other's hands saying, wow, this is such an exciting moment. It is just amazing to think that Australia is now our partner. So let me talk about the Moon to Mars initiative a little bit. You may have heard of Artemis. That's a very specific part of the program at the beginning, which is to get the first woman and the next man on the surface of the moon by 2024. And that is a very, very focused effort to try to push NASA to bring together capabilities as quickly as possible. But unlike Apollo, where we visited and essentially went camping and then brought home whatever we could fit in the lunar module, our intent is to have a sustainable presence on the moon that helps prepare us for exploring the rest of the solar system, specifically Mars. Mars is a long way away. It's a 6-month trip at the fastest. The moon is only a couple of days away. So if we have the opportunity to create capability on the moon, it will teach us and prepare us. Now, the Australian Space Agency has set aside $150 million to spend on the Moon to Mars initiative. And they have 3 pieces of it. The first one is efforts to insert Australian companies into the global supply chain, meaning getting Australian companies to be working with other countries around the world. Oftentimes that's very difficult to do because you can be very focused on your own country's space efforts. And unless there is an international partnership, there's not much reason to work with companies from other countries. So that global supply chain part is aimed at working on that. And then to perform some demonstration projects And then ultimately fund a trailblazer project, whatever that might be. Let your imagination run free. What is it that Australia could participate in the Moon to Mars program? So after Artemis, the next major step is to build a lunar gateway. It's an orbiting logistics cache that will not be tended 100% of the time. So not like the International Space Station, but just there part-time so that you can store up the equipment and supplies that you need to go to the moon. Boy, if there's one thing we've learned from the International Space Station, it takes a huge amount of supplies to keep people alive and to do science and to maintain wherever you're living and build it. And you have to have a place to store all those supplies until you're ready for humans to use them. Ultimately, this is just a concept that's been proposed by the European Space Agency. But if you want to think about it a little bit like the International Space Station, where each country can have whatever facilities it chooses to, but they are connected to each other and they share important infrastructure and resources. It's really nice to know if you run out of oxygen, you can run next door and borrow a cup. So that's the idea. It's to have some kind of a sustained presence. We'll all practice, we'll all learn, just as we've learned from living full time on the space station for almost 20 years now. We'll be doing the same thing. We'll be learning on the surface of the moon to prepare us to go to Mars. I'd like to mention that my company, Nova Systems, has partnered with several other companies, Woodside Energy, University of Western Australia, Curtin University, and the Government of Western Australia, and Fugro. And we have formed a consortium, a nonprofit consortium called AROSE, the Australian Remote Operations for Space and Earth. Personally, I think Australia is absolutely the global leader in remote operations. And the idea is, can we develop technologies that have applicability both to industry here terrestrially, but also the capability to enhance our remote operations skills on the moon, which is going to be really important. Like I said, especially at first, humans are not going to be there all the time. We need to have remote operations. So a lot of interesting and exciting opportunities commercially, transportation to and from the moon, just like we have commercial transportation to and from the space station. And also, ultimately, resource extraction, especially water, which is rocket propellant. So if you can extract that from the surface of the moon, you wouldn't have to carry all that rocket propellant all the way from the Earth. So that'll be very interesting. Once again, stay tuned. So in summary, I'd just like to say there are tremendous opportunities for space jobs in Australia. The Space Agency has published a list of their focus areas, and I've included some of them here, but the truth is there's all kinds of startups, there's all kinds of exciting ideas happening. So this is definitely going to be a growth area, and there will be lots of jobs available in the future. And finally, I'd like to say that one of the experiences that you get from being in space is realizing how deeply, deeply connected we all are. It's very easy to sit in Australia and say, what happens on the other side of the Earth doesn't really affect me, and vice versa. In fact, that's not true at all. You can see very clearly from space that the Earth is one deeply interconnected ecosystem, and what you do on one part of the Earth affects the others. That's why it is so important that we partner together to go out into space, because in fact, the things that we're doing in space are meant to benefit all of us here on Earth. So from an astronaut's perspective, looking down at the Earth, you realize that it's a spaceship and we're the crew, and we have to take care of our spaceship, and we also have to take care of each other. So I would be happy to take some questions now.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for that, Pam. They were really interesting slides and super cool to hear about your history and also what you think Australia, where we're going. We had an audience question. from Johnny. You mentioned how government space sectors are struggling to keep up with the commercial side. What would you think, or what do you think should be done to have a more balanced and progressive industry as a whole? What are your suggestions for that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think probably I can highlight some of the contrasting principles with a few specific examples. So cutting red tape, fostering innovation, funding research, encouraging exciting new business models. Awesome. What about orbital debris? If you're going to send 1,500 satellites up, what's the potential impact on orbital debris in low Earth orbit? What if those satellites hit each other, or hit somebody else's? What if while you're launching a rocket, it explodes and a big piece falls down and hits a house, or worse, a person? So those are some of the things that I think we're really wrestling with. When only the government was going to space, we could develop lengthy processes, particularly in human space flight, to try to be very methodical and responsible for everything that we were doing. But in a lot of ways, the government moves really slowly. We need the speed and innovation that comes from industry, but we also need to make sure that we have the practices and we can help and also have the oversight and the regulations to make sure that it's happening safely. As you will find as you go on in life, if it was simple, somebody would just go do it. Instead, usually there's at least two, what I would say, competing, and sometimes more, three principles that all sound good, each individually. It's trying to make them all work together.
Yeah, absolutely. Following on from that, another question from James. How do you see the commercial industry growing in the next 10 years? Do you think it's going to be hindered by the red tape, like you said, or do you think we're going to be able to move at a quicker rate than we have been in the past?
My personal view is that there's enough money flowing into it from an investment standpoint that it won't stand for red tape. Industry will push back on red tape. And really, it's the job of government, in my opinion, having worked on both sides of the fence, it's the job of government to try to stay ahead, which is awfully hard to do. And it can be very, very hard to get anybody activated on solving a problem that isn't this year's problem. Until next year it is, and you could have spent some time thinking about it. So I think really looking ahead in the future is really important. So you're not caught flat-footed by industry. It's really important that industry also understand the challenges, the political challenges and other things that happen when you work inside the government. So red tape can be really frustrating, but there are really serious responsibilities around safety as well. And that's the challenge. And you know what I found, especially as a regulator, this is about conversations. You can't have a wall between industry and regulators or anybody in government. There needs to be a lot of conversation. There needs to be relationships, mutual respect and understanding, but most importantly, transparency and the willingness to talk and to share, the perspectives that you have. Because really, we need both sides to solve it. We're not going to be able to know one side or the other isn't going to fix it.
Absolutely. So following on from industry and regulators, you've worked in both fields, obviously. How did you find the transition? Did you run into any big problems, like you had to do a mentality switch and it was just really hard? Or how did you find moving from one to another and then back again when you came to Australia?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, actually. I spent most of my career as a pilot, as a test pilot, as an operator, as an astronaut, really focused on what I would characterize as technical and operational excellence. And I didn't ask a lot of questions about how much it cost to do something, or frankly, what the policy implications or even the legal implications of what I was doing. I had an interesting experience late in my career at NASA where something that we were trying to do did have legal implications. And at first I was very frustrated. But I learned to listen to the lawyers and eventually found myself completely fascinated and realized that, you know, finance, contracting, law, policy, they're tools in your toolkit. You got to have them, right? So if you want to get anything done, all of these pieces work together, not just the engineering. You have to have all those pieces. So I admit I was not really sure what it was going to mean to go be a regulator. But fortunately, I have to say, this is a really interesting time to have been there. It was, I was there before SpaceX had their first launch to the space station. And that work was happening right then. So talking to industry, seeing the incredible energy and new technologies, I saw it all coming before it happened. And it was exciting. And I think that, you know, regulators have to have responsibilities. There has to be respect on both sides. But I really saw that there was a way to encourage and facilitate the industry as well as regulating it. And, you know, I think the successes, frankly, in the United States over the last 10 years have been a lot because the FAA, who has that responsibility in the United States, it's not NASA, it's a separate organization, has figured out how to balance those two things. And so, I mean, it's great to see when it works well. So from that standpoint, I will say though, after I felt like I'd learned a lot, I got pretty itchy to go build something. So I wanted to go back to industry.
Can't win. So now you are in industry working with Nova Systems. You said that they're involved with the Moon to Mars initiative. What other projects are they working on at the moment that you can share with us?
Well, yeah, nobody has a contract under Moon to Mars with the Australian Space Agency yet. It's all under discussion at this point. We work together with other companies to form the AROSE consortium because we see that remote operations is a real potential growth area for space in the future, and that has terrestrial applications as well. But NOVA is actually already involved with communications. So that's been a big area of interest as they supported defense. In addition to that, NOVA is very familiar with launch because of working out at the range at Woomera with hypersonic vehicles and other vehicles, and to understand all of those things. So there's careers in launch safety, in communications, in remote operations, and a lot of autonomous vehicles and things like that. And who knows what else? There'll be more. I'm sure it's going to grow.
Absolutely. Another audience question, a bit of a different direction. Orbital debris is a big issue. Have you ever experienced firsthand some of the impacts of orbital debris?
I most definitely have, as has everyone who's flown in space. You know, there was a pretty scary near miss, I guess about 8 years before no, not even that long, maybe 5 years before my first flight. And a piece of debris hit the radiator in the payload bay door of the shuttle. Well, if it had been maybe 2 or 3 centimeters from a different area, all of the cooling fluid would have leaked out of the space shuttle, requiring an emergency return to Earth, probably a bailout over the ocean, and a complete loss of the vehicle. So after that, we started protecting the payload bay doors and flying in a different orientation straight ahead, because that's the worst case, is having debris hit you head on going the opposite direction. On every single one of my flights, and each one of them had more than the previous, we would look at the windows of the space shuttle and see these little spider cracks in at least 2 or 3 places around the windows. So the panes of several of those, the outer pane of the window had to be replaced after landing. Fortunately, there are 3 pressure panes on the space shuttle, actually 2 pressure and 2 thermal. And so, you know, we were safe, but you could definitely see it. And it's quite interesting. If you look at pictures of the space station, you can definitely see where there have been some hits on the radiators and on the solar arrays. Now, we built extra shielding around where the humans live, the pressure vessels, to protect them. But this is just, it is absolutely a defining problem of our time.
So another different direction. A question from Oscar in the audience. While there are examples of great international cooperation in the ISS and Curiosity, would you say cooperation between companies is improving, or are competing interests, political interests, maybe threatening this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I can tell you that I was very excited that Australia was one of the first to step up to the Moon to Mars program. Japan, Canada, and Europe have all expressed interest in joining. And I think that's really a sign. I mean, I really hope that Russia joins. You know, we've been key. They've been the major partner on the space station between the U.S. and Russia. And I really hope they choose to join the Moon to Mars program. We have such a great relationship with them now on the operations of the space station, flying with Russian cosmonauts on every single flight. So, and as well as American astronauts on every flight. So it's, yeah, I have hopes. Actually, it's one of the things is having that partnership with NASA has actually been the one really bright area of the relationship between the US and Russia. Hoping for more.
Fingers crossed. Back to orbital debris, another question on that. How do you think we can manage it as the commercial sector grows? So specifically with CubeSats in low Earth orbit, what are the strategies for working around that?
Right. Well, so there's a lot of really good proposals on the table, which, you know, currently, if you go into low Earth orbit, you're expected to deorbit within 25 years of your time in space. Now, many of these CubeSats have no thrusters, so they can't move out of the way of debris, or if they're getting in the way of a larger satellite, they can't move. We don't actually have any rules on that. I mean, it's kind of obvious. If only one satellite can maneuver, you want them to maneuver. But really, one of the biggest issues that we're facing is what we call space situational awareness or space domain awareness. It's actually the ability to track the objects in space. So we have telescopes dotted around the world. And in fact, Australia has the Space Surveillance Telescope, as well as several other capabilities, which has been incredibly important and has really enhanced our awareness in space to see what's going on. We usually use radar for looking at things in low Earth orbit and optical telescopes to see things in geosynchronous orbit. So the problem is we don't have what's called custody, meaning that we're not tracking every single thing all the time. And we especially can't keep track of things smaller than about 10 centimeters. So if it's, you know, we're working on it. We're being able to network some things and trying to get down to 5 centimeters. But objects between 2 and 5 centimeters are a real threat to satellites, and we cannot easily track them right now. So yeah, when I was at DARPA, I had somebody come in probably once a week with some funky, cool idea for vacuuming up all the debris. There were 2 issues. The first one is if it's small enough that you don't see it coming, we're also probably not tracking it. So how do we track better, right? We have to be able to see it to go fix it and find it. The second piece is something that might surprise everyone, which is that there's liability involved. If your country sends something to space, the government, even if it's a private company that sent it to space, the government for that company is legally responsible for any third-party damages. So if that satellite hits another satellite, technically you can go back to the government of that country and demand restitution. So most countries require launch insurance. There's some discussions happening about requiring insurance for on orbit too, so that the liability can rest where it belongs, which is the company that does the launching, rather than woohoo, the government's going to write the check, right? You can't have that. So right now, those things are sort of holding people back a little bit, though. I mean, if you go out and you're playing around with, a catcher's mitt or a harpoon or whatever, how do you know the debris that you're catching is from your country? What if it's not? What if you miss? What if you make debris while you're trying to collect it? And now you've created a bigger problem. So I think with the companies that are starting to do satellite servicing, it's going to force us to think about those things and come up with new ways to think about liability that will then extend themselves into orbital debris. But those are the two things that, in my mind, I think are going to have to happen.
So again, on the debris topic, a question from the audience is, how could countries work together to improve our space situational awareness, and sort of what strategies are being used at the moment to manage the debris? You said the vacuum doesn't work, unfortunately.
No, the giant Hoover from Spaceballs doesn't work. No. So yeah, there's actually a lot going on in this area. I mean, the U.S. is a leader in this area because, frankly, we have the best network. It's called the Space Surveillance Network, and we have the best network of optical and radar equipment. But as I mentioned, it's not perfect, and it's certainly not perfect globally. So there's a special relationship between the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. It's called the Five Eyes relationship, and it is a very special relationship where there's a lot of information sharing. And in fact, space situational awareness is a key part of that. I will just give you my opinion, which is we have this great relationship. We're already sharing data. We just need to strengthen that relationship, strengthen the networking of our telescopes, our equipment, even our algorithms to do a better job of tracking. And I think we need to also partner together on this liability piece and these demonstrations. I think we should be doing more work together because if you can get a few like-minded people working on something together, other people, if you're successful, other people will join.
So with international collaboration, following on from that, you spoke about the LunarGateway and a constant presence on the moon with the concept design from ESA for the moon village. But if we're not going to be constantly living there in the initial stages, the audience is asking, how can we maintain the gateway to a standard that will allow us to be there or maintain that presence without astronauts constantly living there to maintain it?
Well, that's a really good question. And I'm hoping that Australia will be a part of the answer with remote operations, right? I guess I can just say that you do have to remember that most satellites do not actually have people living on board. So, we know how to operate a satellite in space. Actually, the most complicated thing that you can do is gateway, something like that, where you have people sometimes, but not all the time. And, if you have people all the time or never, that is pretty clear. We know how to design to those standards. This is a great point, that this is the most complicated. I think that this is going to be a huge issue going to Mars because the round trip of communications is so long. You can't really watch things happening in real time out at Mars. There's a little tiny delay out to the moon, but not enough to make a huge difference. It might be a few seconds. It just depends on the latency in the communication system, maybe up to 10 or 20 seconds, we'll see. But the difference is that you could perhaps have automated activities that humans were what we call on the loop, meaning they can take over if they need to, but pretty much they're just monitoring to make sure things go okay. If you stop and think about what's happening in the Pilbara right now in remote asset management, you have drillers in Perth operating excavating equipment thousands of kilometers away. You then have a few people out there, right? This is a hard thing, is you gotta link them together. But even so, the ability to load up an autonomous truck, which autonomously takes the ore or whatever it is that you've extracted to an autonomous train, which then takes it out autonomously to the dock, thousands of kilometers away. That is the kind of thinking that we're going to have. We're going to have robotics that's capable of doing what a spacewalker would. In building the space station, we used this big giant robot arm that was capable of lifting huge objects, things that weighed, I don't know, 15,000 kilograms. But it wasn't very good at fine dexterous things like drilling things or making connections and that kind of stuff. We're going to have to develop the robotics that has the capability to do that, both outside but also inside Gateway. And there's a light switch. It's got to be able to know how to turn it on, and also open up a hatch and do things like that. So it's a huge challenge, but I actually think the technology, we can see it from here.
Yeah, awesome. Hopefully Australia being in our unique position with so many remote mining sites, like you said, will be able to help with the capability development there. Just a reminder to the audience, if you want, you can ask questions in the comment section underneath the live screen. So feel free to chuck anything in there. Pam is happy to answer. I have a question. You mentioned water for propellant and extracting that from the moon. I can see that there's going to be some problems potentially with that, both with treating the moon as a heritage site and not damaging it. And also, can you explain how we use water for propellant? I'm not.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. Well, actually, the space shuttle used two kinds of propellant. One was a solid rocket propellant that was actually kind of a form of plastic. And so the interesting thing about solid rocket fuel is when you do ignite it, there's really no way to throttle it. There's some tricks you can do, but for the most part, that thing is going to burn. And the solid rocket boosters on either side of the space shuttle used solid rocket propellant. But the main engines of the shuttle used liquid propellant, and that was hydrogen and oxygen. So when you mix them together, I mean, some of you may have even done some experiments in school about using electricity to separate hydrogen and oxygen from water. Well, it takes energy to do that. But when you put them together with an ignition source, it's rocket fuel. There are other kinds of rocket fuel as well, but hydrogen and oxygen are extremely efficient forms of rocket fuel. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. We have to have a safe, thoughtful, and responsible way of extracting resources on the moon. I do have to say that at least we don't have to worry about stealing anyone's resources or giving them giving the natives some kind of terrible diseases that they've never been exposed to before, or some of those other kinds of things. But we do have to worry about, we definitely don't want to pollute the moon. There are places that are World Heritage Sites. Yeah, the Apollo landing sites, they should be treated as special. The good news is we think actually there's a place where most of the water is, although there may be water under the surface as well. And that's in permanently shadowed craters on the moon, and the South Pole in particular, but potentially on the North Pole as well. And we know that there's water there because a little satellite called L-Cross was intentionally crashed, and then astronomers looked at the plume and realized that there was water that had vapor that had come up from the surface. So, so that would be one way of dealing with it. It's a very structured area, but it's another reason why countries need to work together. We need to come up with a responsible way of, even today, you can't just go dig anywhere you want to on the Earth. You have to get a permit and a license to do that. You have to have an environmental impact, and you're supposed to be doing it in the terms of that environmental impact and doing it safely. And so I think we need to have a regime like that for the moon for sure.
Absolutely. So following on from having a presence on the moon and not damaging it, or not, I guess, yeah, treating it not necessarily as a heritage site, but making sure that we're not crossing any boundaries. When we plan, or when we build this moon village, how are we going to make sure that that isn't entrenching on the heritageness of the moon? That's a terrible way to word it, but
well, yeah, that's a great question. You know, obviously, there's probably different opinions on that. I mean, there are some people who would say, wouldn't that be awesome if we landed near the Apollo 11 site? I would love to see it. Would I love to? I'd love to see it. So is that a way that you could protect it? I think, you know, this is another area where the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 has not, it's a treaty of principles. It's not, it says we agree to these principles. Now, the details are usually spelled out in each country's laws. How are they going to fulfill the principles that they agreed to in the Outer Space Treaty? We're starting to ask questions that no one has ever asked before. I think the framers of the treaty had some pretty good ideas, especially around the principles. But now we need to sort of get down to, okay, how are we really going to do this? And I don't think we have solid answers about that yet. I mean, I think, obviously, you know, talk about competing principles, right? Wouldn't you want to go to the safest place? Or wouldn't you want to go near where the water was so that you could, you know, have sustainable resources, and so forth. And so I think we just really need to consider all of those things. Fortunately, it's not a problem yet. If you can imagine trying to protect, you know, 3 or 4 spots on the surface of the Earth, the moon's smaller, but it's still a very big place. We know where those things are. We do have to do more resource mapping and understand where there are special and unique places on the moon, perhaps places that are of immense scientific significance. I think one of the exciting things about exploration is, well, let's put it this way, humans covered more of the surface of the moon in the Apollo program than they have in every other rover put together on Mars. So we have the opportunity to learn a lot more about what places we should protect. And, you know, frankly, that's part of the reason why the government needs to lead the way with the government program. And they need to have oversight of industry, right? So the government is going to be responsible. They should be responsible. They're accountable for those things. And especially when you do it with international partners, the likelihood that you'll be thoughtful is much higher.
Absolutely. I have a fun question from the audience. What things from Earth did you miss whilst you're in space?
Ooh, popcorn. So everything floats in space. And so let's see, I may even be able to, hang on a second. Let's see if I can share. Let's see, share a picture of one of my crewmates, Paolo Nespoli, from, there we go. There's the picture I wanted to show. So food, you know, when everything floats, that's actually a real problem. And especially when you think about eating a biscuit and all the crumbs that land in your lap, and instead they're floating around, you know, getting in people's eyes or into the computers. And so the food that we take with us is meant to be rehydrated. There's some fresh food, but it's very limited. And Paolo is showing how some it's like a risotto. It's a pasta that he brought with him and rehydrated. And it'll stick to the spoon because it's sticky and it has sauce on it. And so when you can eat things like that, it'll stay on the spoon as you try to eat. But as soon as you start eating crunchy or seriously messy food like pizza or hamburgers, that's when things start to go downhill really fast, right? So we don't even try. So you do end up missing really crunchy food. I also missed like salad, really super fresh vegetables that, especially the ones that had a crunch to it. I did miss taking a shower. We used sponge bath. It's not practical to shower in space. And so you just have to take a towel and get it wet with a little soap and, give yourself a bath. And it's not quite the same as standing under a stream of hot shower, right? So, but I think everyone would tell you that the thing you miss most in space is your family. It's a weird thing about being in space. When you're on the ground, it's all you can think about is when am I going to go fly again? And then you get up in space and you look down at the Earth, and that's where everyone you know and love is, other than your crew, who you also know and love, but you really miss your family.
Absolutely. Could imagine it would be really hard, especially for, how long was your longest stint in space?
So my longest was only 16 days because I was on board the shuttle. But yes, we've had an experiment with two crew, one from Russia and one from the United States, that lived in space for a whole year. Normally it's about 6 months. That's a year is a long time.
A year is a very long time. Absolutely. All right. I'll just flick through, pardon me, the interview questions. We have one coming in from the audience with regards to the commercial space aspect. Here we go. So from the audience, do you see Australia having an astronaut program at some point in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. As I mentioned, the space agency is extremely focused on industry, right? And the growth of the capability of Australia to participate. And the human piece is certainly an aspect of that. I think it is not their focus in the near term. But what's interesting about these opportunities is that if there are astronauts going on a regular basis to the moon, eventually, depending on Australia's commitment, and that's how it works on the space station, right? It's not random. there's agreements that are made, and if the participation rises to a certain threshold, the opportunity exists to send an Australian to astronaut training and participation in a mission. And so I think, we're getting ahead of ourselves because we don't actually know what Australia is going to contribute to Moon to Mars. But if it's big enough and important enough, the likelihood is that it will get offered at some point in the future. And then if you take a look at commercial space, there's an awful lot of interest in the tourism and research and education market where people can go up to space commercially. Those missions need crews, which typically come from test pilots, of which Australia has many, but also scientists as well. So I think it's clearly inevitable that more Australians are going to go to space. It's just not clear whether they're going straight to the moon or whether a lot will go fly commercially first. We'll just have to see as the industry develops.
Absolutely. So with the space program currently, the International Space Station is being deorbited in the next few years, and then the LunarGateway program will take over. Is there going to be some kind of break or a period where there's not a human presence in space, and what are the consequences of that going to be?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, there is a timeline right now, which is officially I believe it's 2024, but there's a lot of discussion about extending the International Space Station to 2028. That's absolutely possible to do. And I think as long as the maintenance of the station is going okay, it could absolutely extend to 2028. So if we send, astronauts to the surface of the moon in 2024. I don't think Gateway is going to be a part of that in 2024, but it will certainly be in progress. So yeah, it's hard to say. They're not completely linked, but I think it's a really smart question, because the truth is, this is all about resources. And so this has been a long-term issue for NASA, is how hard it is to run two big programs at the same time, and how much that potentially could cost. And so there is a lot of interest in trying to, keep that sequence. The problem is, developing these new things always takes longer than you think it will. So just when you think you got it worked out perfectly, it all falls apart. And I mean, I have to say, look at, the space shuttle ended in 2011, and we were hoping to have commercial vehicles and Orion and other vehicles flying a while ago. That's another story that has more to do with space policy and the changes of administration in the United States. But I think it's hard to optimize, is the short answer.
Yeah, could imagine. Nothing's quick.
Yeah.
Another question from audience from Jake. As a non-US citizen, where you spoke about Australian astronauts are potential and inevitable in the future, but right now, how can Australians be involved with NASA and other space companies?
Well, believe me, the space companies are coming to Australia. They are absolutely coming to Australia, and they are looking to hire people. Australia itself has a ton of very exciting startups, like Myriota. I'm on the board of Myriota as well. And Gilmore Space, I've been advising them as well. They're building a hybrid rocket. So there's lots of commercial companies starting. One of the things that has been very, very interesting to me, working with Australians, is to discover how many Australians there are working at NASA and working for the European Space Agency and so forth. And so a lot of people who were really excited about working in space saying, okay, well, Australia's not doing it, so I need to move somewhere else. What I'm excited about is that we're beginning to see that some of those expats are interested in coming back and bringing the experience that they had. So really, I think it's the goal of the Australian Space Agency that you won't ever have to ask that question again. There just will be lots of opportunities.
Would you recommend, if a colleague was considering moving to Australia, would you recommend working in Australia?
Not only would I have, and there are multiple examples of colleagues who I have reached out to me and said, Pam, tell us what's going on in Australia. And I've been able to enthusiastically say, hey, they're wide open to help. There's lots of exciting things happening. It is very exciting. I mean, it was very exciting to me to be a part of the beginning of, to see Australia join global international space exploration. I mean, before they just weren't even at the table. And now there's agreements for Moon to Mars. There's other international agreements. The space agency is signed with Europe and Japan and Canada and UAE and lots of countries. And so I think Moon to Mars is only just the beginning. I think Australia is a happening place in space right now.
Awesome. Another audience question. So with the Australian Space Agency, as we establish that and our space presence, what are some important things that we can learn from other countries and their space agencies to ensure our success?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. I mean, there are lots of lessons to be learned, and certainly the space agency is asking them. What they're really trying to do is look at what's gone well, at what's worked well, especially working with industry. I mean, looking at the way NASA has approached commercial space, I think has been very, very interesting. They have been structuring programs for some years now that were along the lines of, okay, we're going to participate in developing a capability that we would like to then pay you as a service for later. And cargo to the space station is a great example. I mean, there are lots of people who back in 2009 thought this was a lunatic idea, right? That a company could go off on its own, design a spacecraft, and then, and of course they needed help, and they did get help from NASA. They got financial help during the development, not 100%. They had to bring their own skin to the game, but they got technical help as well. And so NASA helped them, participated in reviews, gave them technical advice, and so forth. And eventually, after they demonstrated the capability, then they said, right, okay, you're ready to do this on your own. This is just a contract now. You know, we'll keep buying whatever, you know, however many rides to the space station. What was significant in May of this year was that first demonstration mission of taking crew to the space station. That was executed by SpaceX, but in fact with significant NASA oversight. Because of the success, they're stepping back a little bit, and I think the next mission is also executed by NASA, as I understand it. But going forward, there will just be a contract, just like buying an airline ticket. You're buying seats to the space station. So that is a very important way of working with industry, is, you know, to fund them, to give them technical expertise, and then also to help be a part of the market. And of course, if you look at defense in Australia is one of the biggest markets. So the space agency needs to work closely with defense to make sure that they're encouraging companies that Australian defense wants to buy services from, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Another audience question, this time in regards to test pilot and flying. Did being a test pilot make you feel more comfortable flying to space? And did the training involved with the continuous testing and pushing these vehicles' boundaries change the way you look at space travel?
Oh, well, I think, you know, from my perspective, yeah, that's a complicated question. I mean, I think as obviously I wouldn't be a test pilot if I didn't think that I was prepared to deal with whatever came next as a test pilot. One of the big differences between test pilots and non-test pilots is that test pilots have to have a technical background. They have to have enough technical understanding to be able to understand all of the underpinnings, the modeling, simulation, the aerodynamics, the performance assessments. And at the same time, you also have to be able to perform the precision flying, and you have to be able to understand the operational implications of what you're doing. You know, why does it matter that this didn't work right? An engineer might say that, and it's like, no, that actually really matters. You know, that was actually hard or complicated, or it took me too long to perform the task because of the flying qualities and things like that. So, you know, ideally, you know, as a test pilot, you participate heavily in the safety discussions around everything before you go to do something, especially for the first time. I don't think you have to be a test pilot to be an astronaut. But you may note that the crew of the first flight to the space station of the SpaceX Crew Dragon was a test pilot and a flight test engineer. And so that is a specific specialty and background that when you're flying a vehicle for the first time, that you know how to do the assessment and the analysis and ask the right questions before you go. So that's a special skill, I think. Did it make me more comfortable? Of course it did. Made me more comfortable to know what was going on with my vehicle.
I hope so. Another question. I've got a question in regards to that. You said you flew C-17s and I forgot the name. Sorry, KC-10s. Obviously, there would be a lot of training going into that and getting you up to speed on how to fly the vehicle. Can you give me like an estimate, weeks, months, and what kind of training? Is it written procedures, or they take you through flight simulators? What's the process for learning how to fly one of those?
Yeah. So it all starts actually with pilot training. So there's, a basic pilot training course, which teaches you the fundamental skills of flying, navigating, flying in instrument conditions, and so forth. And then you learn the specifics around the systems of that aircraft. And you do that by practicing in the simulator, particularly if you're practicing emergency procedures where you're, shutting down engines and bailing out and things like that. You can practice that in the simulator, all those procedures without actually having to bail out of the aircraft or shut an engine down real time in flight. And then you of course fly at first with an instructor pilot and then on your own. So as a test pilot, the interesting thing about flying the C-17 is there were some people who were designated as instructors, but the truth is we had very little time on the aircraft. So our deep knowledge of it was theoretical. So there was a flight manual. It was our job to make sure that it was correct, to add notes, warnings, and cautions to other pilots, and to participate in that. So you and as a test pilot, part of a test pilot school is they put you into a lot of different airplanes. I mean, I've flown over 60 different kinds of aircraft. And so you're like, oh yeah, I recognize this. This must work like that one airplane I flew that one time. And it makes it pretty, you kind of carry a database in your head of all the different ways people have solved problems, like how to put the gear down. And so, you can quickly assess, is that a good way for this aircraft? Does it work? If something unexpected happens, you're more likely to have some knowledge of what's fundamentally happened and how to correct it. So yeah, pilot training is fun.
It sounds very intense.
It is, but it's fun.
Question from Suzanne from the audience. As someone who's about to start uni next year, what qualifications would be best to gain employment in the space industry in Australia? So the question is like a particular type of engineering, physics, straight to test pilot school. What do you reckon?
Oh, well, nobody goes straight to test pilot school. You have to have years of experience as a pilot before you can go to test pilot school. But for technical background, I'm just going to tell you the advice that I got actually about being an astronaut, which was any kind of technical background is going to be welcome. Now, having said that, I would say there is a very strong demand for engineering capability. But if you have a physics degree, you're going to be able to figure that out, I think. Really, I do think that engineering is going to play a very important role and will continue to, but it's not the only thing. It does need to be a technical area for some of the things, but I brought up, how many space policy and legal issues have I brought up this morning? I brought up a ton. So I think, and remember, industry is not just made up of a bunch of engineers running a company. There has to be finance, there has to be contracting, there have to be people who do marketing, and so forth. And so there's a lot of room in the space industry for people with all kinds of interests and backgrounds. I mean, I personally think that engineering is where you can rise to be the CEO of the company, and it's where the rubber meets the road. And there will always be a demand for engineering in our world. But I think there's also room for everyone. So if engineering turns out not to be for you, you just shouldn't be discouraged by that.
Absolutely. There's plenty more pathways to the space industry, not just engineering. A more personal question. What is the number one career highlight for you? The most defining thing, the one that you would say is the top moment of your career?
Whew.
top three if you can't narrow it down to one.
Yeah, well, I mean, also, I kind of have an interesting perspective about that. I don't, like a pilot, I don't look at the runway behind me. I look at the runway ahead of me, and I'm hoping that I have more career highlights to come. You know, clearly, being in Australia for the birth of a space agency has definitely got to be one of them. But that's extremely different than being the commander of a space shuttle crew who saves the space station, which is what happened on my third flight. There was a very, very serious problem that we encountered during the construction of an element of the space station, and we had to send spacewalkers out on a life-threatening emergency repair, and we saved the station. So that was kind of a highlight. So, you know, I really, I think I can think back really to all the phases of my career, flying in Desert Storm as a pilot. All three of my missions to space were unique and amazing. To me, helping the commercial space industry launch commercial cargo to the space station, which required closely working with many other government organizations and NASA, and you know, getting the regulation piece right. That was a huge thing to be a part of. And when I worked at DARPA, I was very involved in some technology development that's extremely exciting, and you know, that I think will have a big impact in the future. And then, of course, being in Australia and the space agency. So, you know, I'm having a lot of fun now as an advisor, but I get an opportunity to kind of look under the hood of what's going on, both here in the United States and in Australia. And you know, sometimes the most exciting moments are not the ones that you can talk about or that anybody will ever know about. So it just depends on what phase of your career. Each one of those highlights looks a little different.
Absolutely. Are you looking to stay in the policy part of space industry at the moment with Nova Systems, or are you wanting to go into a different field, or are you happy here?
Oh, I'm happy. I mean, I don't just work with Nova. I also consult here in the United States. I'm on several boards and advisory groups and things like that. I think there's you know, probably another CEO job or something out there for me somewhere. I haven't decided yet. Right now I'm very happy with what I'm doing. But you know, the nice thing about being at my age is that when opportunity comes to the door, I will recognize it and welcome it. And I know that I will. And I feel that that will happen at some point. Policy is, and just to say this is really important to me, there's a lot of people working in policy who are not very technical. And so for me, I am on a giant crusade to make sure that the policy decisions that we make around the world have the right technical and operational underpinnings. In other words, we actually understand the implications of what we're doing and how it is likely to actually unfold. And you know, whether things are realistic to achieve in the time frame, what are the technologies that are most important to invest in, and those kinds of things. And so I find that big picture systems engineering, where you put all the pieces together to make sure that they work, really, really rewarding.
Absolutely. A follow on from the high school student question, for a university student wanting to be involved in the space industry, whether it be locally or overseas, do you have recommendations for qualifications or extracurricular things to do?
To be honest with you, the most important extracurricular activity that you could have is to get an internship with a space company, or any other kind of company. I think but you know, to me, as I look back on my university experience, I learned so much every summer, because I did an internship 3 of the 4 summers. And that's, that really actually honed my understanding of the industry, and of what interested me and what excited me and what it actually took to be successful in the industry. So of everything that you could do, that would be the number one most important thing.
Internships. Awesome. All right. I think we have covered all the audience questions. So if anyone's got any last minute questions, feel free to send them through. Here we go. I think this will be our last one. What does Australian Aerospace have to offer that is different to other bigger international players like NASA or ESA, for example?
Right. Well, yes. So I think that's a good question. I'm not sure Australia has to offer something completely different and unique from everything else. I think it's actually more important that Australia pick a few things to focus on. There's a smaller population, and that means you just don't have as many people to try. I mean, NASA does everything. Australia and most other countries do not do everything. They pick a few things to be really good at, and I pointed some of them out when I spoke earlier. Italy is known for making pressure vessels. Canada is known for big space robotic arms. So I think the challenge for Australia is to define a few things and really go after them. That doesn't mean that industry can't do whatever they want. That doesn't have anything to do with those things. If they can find a market and a business model that closes, have at it and go for it. But I think in terms of the government, and I think industry to some extent as well, should be trying to focus on a few things, because then you can actually make inroads. You can develop a reputation for Australia. And so some of those things, we talked about them: space situational awareness, robotics, remote asset management, very advanced communications like optical comms. Australia has a natural benefit by its location, of course, the other side of the earth from a lot of the space communication systems used by NASA and Europe. But in addition to that, one challenge with optical communications is poor quality through clouds. Well, Australia has a lot of wide open spaces that are clear most of the time. So I think, the space agency's done a pretty good job of trying to pick and trying to focus on some of those areas. And, I know it sounds kind of crazy, but I'd take a look at their strategy because it'll tell you where things are headed.
Just to wrap up with the Back to the Moon to Mars mission, thanks for answering that question about Australian Aerospace. Back to Moon to Mars, what's the one main takeaway that you would like to have people remember? Sorry, just reading an audience question. Yeah, so what's the main takeaway behind the Moon to Mars program for our audience?
Well, I think the most important thing is how critical to Australia participation in the Moon to Mars program is. It's very hard to insert yourself in the global supply chain without those partnerships. They have been of immense benefit to all the countries who've participated in the International Space Station, and I'm 100% sure that Moon to Mars will have a very big positive benefit for Australia as well. And the space agency is working with industry to try to figure out what is Australia going to be known for in the big way. It doesn't, I mean, there's lots of other things that, it doesn't mean you got to pick one thing and go for it, like, pressure vessels. But I think that, there's a lot of other things that happen as well. But, the important thing actually is the dialogue with the space agency and with industry and the open lines of communication to make that happen.
Absolutely. Oh, thank you so much, Pam, for your time. I know it's been a long hour and a half, and it was 6 p.m. when we started in the US, so it's almost bedtime now. We're just getting started in the day. Thank you so much to the audience for coming along. We really appreciate your comments and questions. For upcoming Australian Youth Aerospace Association events, we've got a live Q&A coming up with an astrophysicist, Alan Duffy. So we'll be speaking to Professor Alan Duffy on Thursday, the 22nd of October, so around 2 weeks from now. And the posts will be live around about now. So make sure you go to the event and click going if you want to get reminders about that. So that talk will be Professor Duffy, and he creates baby universes on supercomputers to understand how galaxies like our Milky Way form within vast clouds of dark matter. Sounds pretty interesting. And then following on from that, we've got...
Alan is wonderful. You're going to love him.
Pam's giving him a plug too, so it must be good. And then finally, we've got our Shoal Systems Engineering as a Career panel, which will be 2 pre-recorded videos, and they'll be released. Part 1 will be released on the 15th of October, and part 2 will be released on the 29th of October after the Alan interview. So keep an eye out for those as well. There's plenty of awesome things on offer there, and Shoal is a local Adelaide company, so you may even have the chance to work with them one day. Thanks again so much to Pam and the audience. We really, really appreciate your time. And yeah, tune in on the 22nd of October for our next installment.